Welcome back, Wardens, to Echoes of Thedas, your sanctuary for deep lore dives, immersive narrative exploration, and thought-provoking discussion across the Dragon Age universe. I'm your host, Sevyr, and today we turn our eyes to a moment in Ferelden history that marks the end of an era and the beginning of a legendary journey, the fall of House Cousland. Now in this episode, we're exploring the human noble origin, one of the most emotionally charged and narratively rich starting points in the entire Dragon Age franchise. We'll uncover the legacy and tragedy of the Cousland family, break down the political maneuvering and betrayal by Arl Rendon Howe, and follow the young warden's escape to Ostagar under the protection of Duncan of the Grey Wardens. Through this lens, we'll also unravel the backgrounds and motivations of the central characters: Bryce Cousland, Eleanor, Fergus, Howe, Duncan, and even King Kaelin, giving you a deeper understanding of how each person shaped the path that leads to the Blight and beyond. Now grab your blades, string your bows, and prepare your minds. The fall of House Cousland is not just the beginning, it is the first echo of a world at war. Now, the Couslands are not just nobles. They are legends in Ferelden's political landscape, holding the tenure of High-Ever for generations. Their name carries the weight of history, honor, and service to the realm. Let's actually dive in to a bit of history about High-Ever and the Cousland family. And then I want you in the comment section to go ahead and let me know if you recognize some of the names I mentioned while giving you some history. So the outpost of High-Ever was originally a Benorn held by the Elstan family, who were a secondary branch of the then freeholder family of Howes. Now, during the Towers Age, Ban Conobar Elstan was murdered by his wife Flemeth, thus ending the bloodline. Sevyr Cousland, captain of Conobar's guard, took the lands and title. The Couslands declared their independence from Amaranthine, starting a war that lasted about 30 years. When the war ended, High-Ever won its independence and possession of half the land that had once been southwestern Amaranthine. Now, High-Ever became a tenure during the Black Age. Previously, the Couslands held only a minor title of Ban. And in the current playthrough, you actually hear me talk about a lot of this that I'm talking about now. This is just going into a little more depth. You hear me talk about it with Aldous. Now, during the Lycanthrope Plague, Ban Helia Cousland gathered the lords together under the Cousland banner to drive the werewolves out of their lands, thus earning the title of Teyrn. Now, Calenhad Teyrn was born in High-Ever in the year 510 Exalted as the third son of a poor merchant. He left at a young age to become a squire, but returned during the unification of Ferelden as a Teyrn. Now, the contemporary ruler of Sevyr was Teyrn Cousland. She actually fought the soon-to-be king, Calenhad, in an attempt to maintain Sevyr's independence. When Calenhad's army reached Sevyr, Teyrn led the local bands against him, but they lost against the future king. After Elethea's men were defeated, Calenhad actually asked her to swear fealty. She did, thus allowing the Couslands to retain their tenure in Calenhad's new kingdom. Now, in the beginning of the Storm Age, the Couslands actually conspired with Warden Commander Sophia Dryden in the Grey Warden's attempted rebellion. The rebellion was betrayed to King Arlen by politicians before it even began, and the King's Guard ambushed their meeting place, with the rebels barely managing to escape. The Couslands were a little less fortunate, as King Arlen executed the Cousland Teyrn and a number of other people, and then sent soldiers to Soldier's Peak to stamp out the remainder of the rebellion. And you actually learn about that later on in the game. Now, during the rebellion against Orlais, the Couslands opposed the Orlesian rule. However, Arl Rendon Howe of Amaranthine supported the Orlesians, resulting in several bitter battles between Amaranthine and Sevyr. Eventually, the Couslands managed to capture Harper's Ford and hang Rendon Howe for his treachery. Now, unlike his father, Rendon Howe was part of the rebellion, as was his uncle, Arl Rendon Howe. Rendon and Bryce Cousland fought together at the Battle of White River and were two of the 50 rebels who survived the defeat. Thereafter, Arl Rendon Howe was a great friend of the Couslands. Interesting, right? Crazy how all that unfolds. So let's talk about Bryce. In the game, Bryce is my father. So if we break down Bryce's history, and get into that just a little bit here. So Bryce Cousland is obviously the Teyrn of Sevyr currently, at this point, making him one of the most powerful nobles in Ferelden. He's the husband of Eleanor Cousland and the father of Fergus Cousland and myself, Jorah Cousland. Now, a little background on Bryce. Bryce Cousland is a descendant of Sevyr Cousland and one of the only two remaining Teyrns, the other being Teyrn Logain. During the Orlesian occupation, Bryce fought in the army of the North alongside Arl Leonis Brylan of Southreach and Arl Rendon Howe of Amaranthine at the Battle of White River, from which only 50 rebel soldiers escaped alive. He was injured in the arm during the battle while saving his friend Rendon from a chevalier. After the retreat was sounded, Bryce and Leonis carried their gravely injured friend to a freehold in Redcliffe and stayed with him for a month while the rest of the survivors left to find the army of the South. Now, when Bryce and Leonis finally rejoined the army, making the journey on foot, prince at the time, Merrick, personally awarded them medals of valor. When Rendon married Elaine Bryland, Bryce and his fiancée were the only ones to come witness their vows. So, if you think about it like that, their friendship seemed like it was pretty deep. But remember, the Couslands actually hung Rendon's dad. So, even though they've gone through the heat of battle together, and Bryce was actually the only person that showed up to his wedding, like the friendship there that was thought to be there anyway should have been deeper. But at the same time, Howe probably had a lot of resentment towards the Couslands for hanging his dad. Let's go on. So after King Merritt reclaimed Denerim, the rebel army knew the Orlesians would attempt to take back the city by sea. So Ban Fearchar called upon every available soldier to bolster his fleet in preparation for the attack. With the help of the soldiers, the crew on every one of Fearchar's ships was doubled, and those soldiers who were unable to keep their rations down were stationed along the rocky coast of the Walking Sea to protect the ships by land. So Lord Bryce Cousland, a decorated young military commander, joined the band's fleet and led a contingent of soldiers from the deck of Eleanor's ship, the Mistral. Bryce and Eleanor's first meeting went so terribly that it was immortalized in the famous sea shanty called The Soldier and the Sea Wolf. Now, although Eleanor and Bryce initially came into conflict with each other, the two worked well together. Together, Eleanor and Bryce destroyed 12 warships in the Battle of Denerim Harbor, and the two soon became good friends. Shortly after the battle, Bryce Cousland's father, Teyrn William Cousland, died of an illness, and his only son Bryce was forced to deliver the body from South Reach to Highever. When Bryce arrived at Highever, the nobles were shocked to see the Couslands return to their home after near 70-year absence, and quickly swore fealty to him. Many of Amaranthine's freeholders soon swore allegiance to Bryce instead of their Arl, which complicated the proceedings of Bryce's ascension to Teyrn. It ultimately took Bryce 4 months to claim his seat as Teyrn of Highever, and every day as he waited, he sent a letter to Eleanor. Some days Bryce even sent more than one. The two eventually met face to face once more at King Merritt's formal coronation in the capital. At the coronation, Bryce attempted to propose to Eleanor by singing all 10 verses of The Soldier and the Sea Wolf. He only got to 3 when she accepted his proposal. So, according to Dyron, who is Ban Lorne's son, and also he's there with his mom, Lady Landra. They're at the castle to go actually ride into war with the men. According to him, Bryce is a popular and respected man whom many say should have been king instead of Kaelin. Now that's an interesting outlook. Alright, so leading up to the opening scene of our origin story, let's get into that a little bit. So Bryce and his oldest son, Fergus Cousland, are preparing the armies of Sevyr to march for Ostagar when Duncan makes an unannounced arrival during his search for new recruits. Arl Rendon Howe, a longtime friend and ally of Bryce's, is also at Castle Cousland waiting for his troops to arrive. After a brief discussion, Bryce sends his child, myself, off to say goodbye to Fergus, as he will be departing earlier with Sevyr's troops, while Bryce elects to depart with Arl Howe when his troops arrive. Before they leave, Bryce informs his youngest that they will steward Sevyr while he and Fergus are away. While Bryce's youngest child leaves to attend to their duties, Duncan, Rendon, and Bryce discuss some important matters. And that's when we actually go and explore the castle in the playthrough. And if you're following along with that, then you know what happens after. So let's go back and actually talk about some of the other characters. First of which is going to be my mother in the game, Lady Eleanor Cousland. So Eleanor, whose maiden name is Eleanor Mac Ainrag, was the daughter of Ban Fearchar Mac Ainrag of the Storm Coast, a famous raider who was known as the Storm Giant. From birth, Eleanor and her 3 siblings were raised on the deck of a warship. Although all 4 of the Mac Ainrag children were skilled raiders, Eleanor was by far the most skilled. And at the age of 15, she took down her first Orlesian warship. Eleanor's ship, the Mistral, soon became infamous for capturing and sinking Orlesian ships. As Eleanor's reputation grew, the Orlesians soon began to call her the Sea Wolf. And eventually, her name began to overshadow that of her father. After King Merritt reclaimed Denerim, the rebel army knew the Orlesians would attempt to take back the city by sea, so Ban Fearchar called upon every available soldier to bolster his fleet in preparation for the attack, which we already heard that when we were talking about Bryce. So it really breaks down to her being a skilled warrior, commander, and sea captain, basically. Before she even knew Bryce, she was basically raised that way, which is actually really cool. And then, as we heard earlier, they did a lot of damage together against the Orlesians, taking down several ships, like a dozen or so. And then, at the coronation of Merrick, Bryce proposed to her, and she accepted. So Eleanor is really a sharp and quick-witted woman, as she will brazenly show if the Warden evades her questioning about their desires to become a Grey Warden recruit. Though very aware of the blight, Eleanor carries herself as befitting a woman of her stature. In conversation with the Warden, she'll reveal that she is as worried as the Teyrn about the impending blight. Now, if you're a female warrior playthrough, the Teyrn refers to herself as a former battle maiden. So you know moms is hardcore, okay? So let's go ahead and get into my older brother Fergus, who is the heir to Highver. And on the eve of the fifth blight, Fergus actually leads the Cousland's troops to Ostagar to answer the King Kaelin's call. So let's talk a little bit about Fergus. He was trained as a warrior and married to Oriana, the daughter of a wealthy Antivan trader with whom he has a son, Orin, my nephew. Despite his martial skill, many outside of Highver speculate that Fergus's younger sibling, which is me, is more likely to become Teyrn of Highver than Fergus himself. So, although Fergus is well-liked, charismatic, and trusted by both his father and the troops he commands, he leads the Cousland forces to Ostagar at King Kaelin's call, unaware that in his absence, basically, his entire family is slaughtered. Now, Fergus's survival becomes a long-burning ember of hope and unresolved grief. His absence in the betrayal is a cruel irony. He is the heir, but the burden of vengeance falls on me. Now, my backstory in the whole midst of things is I'm the youngest. So I'm trained in tactics, combat, noble affairs. I have a future either as a commander or courtier. Now, this particular origin is shaped by love, expectation, and the privilege of being raised in a noble house. My actual survival and eventual ascension as a Grey Warden becomes the thread by which House Cousland's legacy continues. Their trauma defines many key choices across the Blight. Now, according to the Codex entry, the history of Highver says Highver lies in Ferelden's northwestern reaches, just beside the Waking Sea. The Couslands have held the Teyrn of Highver since before King Kaelin had united Ferelden. Now, the symbolism of the castle itself is a metaphor for stability and tradition. Its fall represents the breaking of Ferelden's noble code, where honor is no longer protection. So let's get into my dad's dear old buddy, Arl Rendon Howe. So in Dragon Age Origins, Arl Howe is a character drenched in duplicity, and his betrayal is one of Dragon Age's earliest and most haunting narrative punches. So Arl Rendon Howe is an old friend of Teyrn Bryce Cousland and the Arl of Amaranthine. He's also the father of Nathaniel Howe, who becomes a companion in the DLC Dragon Age Origins Awakening. But we'll get into that in another time. So Howe is a veteran of the Orlesian Rebellion, and I'll get into that here in a second. Howe served alongside Bryce Cousland under King Merrick. Though respected early on, Howe always lived in the Cousland's shadow. He coveted the power and status of a Teyrn, but lacked the favor of the court or military achievements to ascend on merit. So during the Orlesian occupation, of Ferelden, Rendon's father, Tarleton Howe, actually sided with the occupiers and was subsequently hanged by the Couslands after they captured Harper's Ford. His uncle Byron became the new Arl of Amaranthine and joined the rebel cause in the year 897 Blessed. Like his uncle, Rendon Howe joined the rebellion led by the future king, Merrick Teyrn. He fought alongside young Bryce Cousland of Highever and Leonis Brylan, future Arl of Southreach, at the bloody Battle of White River. The battle was the most catastrophic defeat of the entire occupation, from which only 50 rebel soldiers escaped alive. Rendon fought with the army of the north led by Ban Angus Earlman, tasked with holding the valley against Orlesian cavalry's charge. He was gravely wounded on the second night and had to be dragged off the field by Bryce and Leonis. When Ban Angus finally announced the retreat, Rendon's friends carried him to a freehold in Redcliffe, while the rest of the survivors left to find the army of the south. Bryce and Leonis stayed with Rendon almost a month while he recuperated. Though all three were personally decorated for valor by the King Merrick, Rendon was too wounded to rejoin the army, and while his friends joined the army of the south, he spent months in Southreach being tended by Teyrn Bryce, who was Leonis' sister and an accomplished physician and herbalist. Byron Howe died just a few months later, which made Rendon the new Arl. Teyrn Bryce insisted on accompanying him to Amaranthine. He proposed to her a year later, saying that if she wasn't going to leave already, they might as well marry. That's a hell of a proposal. Now, Leonis had become concerned by the changes in his friend's behavior since the battle and attempted to prevent the marriage. When Rendon told him that he needed her for dowry and connections, he severed all contact. Now, because some believe the Arling should have passed to Byron's daughter, and because Elaine was half Orlesian, only Bryce Cousland and his fiancée came to witness their vows. They had 3 children, Nathaniel, Thomas, and Delilah, who is the one that Arl Howe tells me asked about me and wanted to see me when he comes to visit. Now, according to their son Nathaniel, Rendon hated his wife, and when asked why, he says that he doesn't know, but he remembers that her family was wealthy. Since the Battle of White River, Howe's abrasive manners have earned him almost universal dislike among all of his peers. Now imagine that. So it seems like Arl Howe's motivations mainly are jealousy of the Couslands' favor with King Kaelin. He's looking for political opportunism during wartime, and possibly the alignment with Logain's broader distrust of the Wardens and Orlesian influence. But that part doesn't really make sense if his wife was half Orlesian, but then if he hated her, that's a whole different story. And then, of course, if he only married her because she wouldn't leave, then that says something about him as well. So the codex entry on Arl Rendon Howe says, once a loyal noble from Amaranthine, Howe has long sought greater influence in Ferelden politics. His ambitions are shadowed by bitterness and personal resentment. So, under the guise of marching to Ostagar, Howe gains permission to station troops at Sevyr. Now, once inside the castle walls, his men poison the guards, open the gates, and slaughter the Cousland household in the dead of night. His betrayal is not only political, it's deeply personal. So let me pose some questions here so we can actually have a discussion about this. So, do we think Howe was acting on Logain's implicit orders, or using the war as a cover for his personal gain? Does Howe represent a failing system of feudal trust where honor can no longer guarantee safety? What would you have done in Eleanor's place? Would you have fled with your child or held the line to the end like she did? Go ahead and answer in the comments below. In the ashes of betrayal, a lifeline emerges. Duncan of the Grey Wardens. His presence at Sevyr wasn't coincidence. It was fate. Now, we'll get into Duncan and the Grey Wardens in the next episode, and we'll deep dive into both of those things. However, at this point, Duncan's relevance is he basically saved me by taking me to Ostagar and recruiting me as a Grey Warden. He sees my potential, invokes the right of conscription to save me. It's literally a symbolic transformation moment from noble scion to Grey Warden initiate for me. Now, the Codex entry for the Grey Warden says, an ancient order created to fight the Darkspawn. Only they can sense the archdemon and end the blight. And that's what we end up becoming. Now, the journey south to Ostagar marks my first encounter with the outside world and a chance to reflect on the loss that I've experienced. Duncan offers little comfort, obviously, but he does offer purpose. Now, I ride not as a noble, but as a survivor. The burden of my family's name, now nearly erased, becomes both a weapon and a wound. Remember, now there's just me and Fergus. And so ends the first chapter of our Warden's story. A chapter written in blood and fire, quite literally. From noble halls to ancient battlefields, our path now leads to Ostagar, where kings plan, generals conspire, and the blight stirs. In our next episode, we'll explore the deep history of the Grey Wardens, the strained alliance between King Kaelin and Teyrn Logain, and the moment that changes the fate of Ferelden forever, the Tower of Ishal. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into origins of House Cousland and the betrayal that shaped a Warden, be sure to like, share, and follow the podcast. Join our growing community on Twitch and Discord to share your thoughts, theories, and even war stories. Until next time, walk always in the light of the Maker and watch the shadows for what lurks beneath.